Hello. This week we're talking with Amelia Earhart, America's First Lady of Aviation. This interview takes place in May of 1937, just 1 month before she takes off to fly around the world. She set many other records, was one of the first aviators to promote commercial air travel, wrote best selling books about her flying experiences, and was instrumental in the formation of the 99s, an organization for female pilots. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. May I call you Amelia?
Yes, please do.
Perfect. Tell me a little about your early life.
Well, I was born and raised in Atchison, Kansas, and later in Des Moines, Iowa. I developed a passion for adventure at a young age, steadily gaining flying experience in my 20s. In 1928, I became the first female passenger to cross the Atlantic by airplane, accompanying pilot Wilmer Stoltz. In 1932, piloting a Lockheed Vega 5B, I made a nonstop solo transatlantic flight, becoming the first woman to achieve such a feat.
And didn't you receive some kind of award for that?
Yes, I received the United States Distinguished Flying Cross for this accomplishment.
That's fantastic. And then didn't you go on to teach somewhere?
Yes, in 1935, I became a visiting faculty member at Purdue University as an advisor to aeronautical engineering and a career counselor to female students. I was also a member of the National Woman's Party and an early supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment.
Amazing early career. I know you were also known as one of the most inspirational American figures in aviation from the late 20s throughout the 30s, and your legacy is often compared to the early aeronautical career of pioneer aviator Charles Lindbergh.
Well, I suppose so.
So then, when were you born?
I was born on July 24th, 1897, in Atchison, Kansas. My father was Samuel Edwin Stanton Earhart, and my mother was Amelia Amy Otis. I was born in the home of my maternal grandfather, Alfred Gideon Otis, who was a former federal judge, the president of the Atchison Savings Bank, and a leading citizen in town.
I understand you were quite a handful when you were younger.
Well, yes, I suppose I was. From an early age, I was the ringleader, while my sister Grace, 2 years my junior, acted as a dutiful follower.
Didn't I read somewhere that you and Grace had nicknames?
Yes, we did. I was nicknamed Mealy, sometimes Millie, and Grace was nicknamed Pidge. Both of us continued to answer to our childhood nicknames well into adulthood. Rather silly, I know.
I don't think that's silly. Wasn't your upbringing a little unconventional?
Yes, my mother did not believe in raising her children to be nice little girls, but our maternal grandmother disapproved of the bloomers we wore, and although I liked the freedom of movement they provided, I was sensitive to the fact that the neighborhood's girls wore dresses. A spirit of adventure seemed to abide in Pidge and me. We'd set off daily to explore our neighborhood. Pidge and I spent long hours playing, climbing trees, hunting rats with the rifle, and belly slamming my sled downhill.
Sounds like you and your sister were very active children. I know I've heard you described as a tomboy. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, I would say that was pretty accurate. Pidge and I kept worms, moths, katydids, and a tree toad in a growing collection gathered in our outings. We also, with the help of my uncle, cobbled together a homemade ramp, fashioned after a roller coaster I had seen on a trip to St. Louis, and secured the ramp to the roof of the family tool shed. My well documented first flight ended dramatically. I emerged from the broken wooden box that has served as a sled with a bruised lip, torn dress, and a sensation of exhilaration. I remember saying, "Oh, Pidge, it's just like flying."
That's a great story. When did you see your first airplane?
I suppose I was about 10 when I saw my first aircraft at the Iowa State Fair in Des Moines. My father tried to interest us in taking a flight. One look at that rickety old plane was enough for me, and I promptly asked if we could go back to the merry-go-round. That old biplane was a thing of rusty wire and wood, and not at all interesting.
Well, that's not the answer I expected. I imagined anything that flew would catch your attention.
Not that one.
So then, When did you really become interested in flying?
I guess I would have to say when a young woman friend and I visited an airfair held in conjunction with the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. This aroused me and led me to all the air circuses in the vicinity. One of the highlights of the day was a flying exhibition put on by World War I ace. The pilot overhead spotted me and my friend as we were watching from an isolated clearing and dived at us. I am sure he said to himself, "Watch me make them scamper." But I stood my ground as the aircraft came close. I did not understand it at the time, but I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by.
So that sparked that interest in flying?
Yes, and in December 1920, my father and I attended an aerial meet at Doherty Field in Long Beach, California. I asked my father about passenger flights and flying lessons. I was booked for a passenger flight the following day at Emory Rogers Field at the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and Fairfax Avenue. It cost $10 for a 10-minute flight with Frank Hawks, who later gained fame as an air racer. Hawks gave me a ride that would forever change my life. By the time I had gotten 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly.
That's great. So then you continued on with lessons after that?
Yes, the next month I recruited Netta Snook to be my flying instructor. The initial contract was for 12 hours of instruction for $500.
That's a lot of money. How did you afford it?
I worked at a variety of jobs, including photographer, truck driver, and stenographer at the local telephone company. I managed to save $1,000 for flying lessons.
So then, did you officially begin your lessons?
I had my first lesson on January 3rd, 1921, at Kinnerfield, which is in the city of Southgate, California. Snook used a crash salvaged Curtiss JN-4 Canuck that she had restored for training.
So, how did you get to the airfield?
In order to reach the airfield, I had to take a bus to the end of the line and then walk 4 miles. My mother provided part of the $1,000 stake against her better judgment, and I cropped my hair short in the style of the other female flyers.
So then, when did you actually purchase your first plane?
6 months later, in the summer of 1921, I purchased a second-hand bright chromium yellow Kinner Airster biplane against Snook's advice, which I nicknamed the Canary. After my first successful solo landing, I bought a new leather flying coat. Due to the newness of the coat, I was subjected to teasing, so I aged it by sleeping in it and staining it with aircraft oil.
Okay, well, you really were an adventurer like when you were young. What other daring flights did you take?
In 1922, I flew a plane to an altitude of 14,000 feet, setting a world record for female pilots. And then in 1923, I became the 16th woman in the United States to be issued a pilot's license.
That's amazing. When did you first think about flying the Atlantic?
Well, after Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927, Amy Guest, another female pilot, expressed interest in being the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. After deciding that the trip was too perilous for her to undertake, she offered to sponsor the project, suggesting that they find another girl with the right image. While at work one afternoon in April 1928, I got a phone call from Captain Hilton H. Rayleigh, who asked me, "Would you like to fly the Atlantic?" Of course, I said yes. I received a rousing welcome on June 19, 1928, when I landed at Woolston in Southampton, England.
That had to be thrilling for you.
It was. My flight crew and I returned to the United States on July 6th. We were greeted with a ticker tape parade along the Canyon of Heroes in Manhattan, followed by a reception with President Calvin Coolidge at the White House.
That's amazing. And to get to meet the president was quite an honor.
Yes, some newspapers and magazines began referring to me as Lady Lindy. The United Press was more grandiloquent to me. I was the reigning Queen of the Air.
Did I read somewhere that you got into speed racing?
I did. I made my first attempt at competitive air racing in 1929 during the first Santa Monica to Cleveland Women's Air Derby, nicknamed The Powder Puff Derby by Will Rogers, which left Santa Monica, California on August 18 and arrived at Cleveland, Ohio on August 26. During the race, I settled into fourth place in the heavy planes division. At the second to last stop at Columbus, my friend Ruth Nichols, who was coming in third, had an accident while on a test flight before the race recommenced. Nichols' aircraft hit a tractor at the start of the runway and flipped over, forcing her out of the race. At Cleveland, I was placed third in the heavy division.
Once you got into flying, you really did it all. When did this idea of flying around the world come to you?
It was in 1937 that I had decided to set out to fly around the world with Fred Noonan as my navigator in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra. It is going to be a 29,000-mile journey, departing from Miami and heading east.
Interesting, Amelia. What's your philosophy on life?
In my life, I had come to realize that when things were going very well indeed, it was just the time to anticipate trouble. And conversely, I learned from pleasant experience that at the most despairing crisis, when all looks sour beyond words, some delightful break was apt to lurk just around the corner.
This has been a fascinating interview, Amelia. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and the best of luck on your upcoming transcontinental flight.
Thank you. And maybe when I return, we can do this again.
She never returned. Amelia Mary Earhart disappeared July 2nd, 1937. Declared dead January 5th, 1939, during an attempt at becoming the first woman to complete a circumnavigational flight of the globe in a Lockheed Model 10E Electra. Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan disappeared over the central Pacific Ocean near Howland Island. The two were last seen in Lae, New Guinea on July 2nd, 1937, on the last land stop before Howland Island, and one of their final legs of the flight. It is generally presumed that she and Noonan died somewhere in the Pacific during the circumnavigation, just 3 weeks prior to her 40th birthday. Nearly 1 year and 6 months after she and Noonan disappeared, Earhart was officially declared dead. Investigations and significant public interest in their disappearance still continue over 80 years later. Join us next week as we talk with Charles Dickens, one of England's most prolific authors. Thank you for joining us, and until next week, take care.